Hello, my name is Dr. Jennifer Derringer, and I work with Dr. Maury Craig in the College of Veterinary Medicine. I'm going to describe to you some of the experimental variables that are to be observed and taken during the camel feeding experiment to occur in the United Arab Emirates at the UAE University, to provide a little bit more detail about some of the variables and how you might collect them so that we can have the best samples collected possible and derive the best data from that. So to begin with, of course, there's some preparation that goes along with the experiment before it even begins. And so as the animals are bought and come into the feeding farm, it's important to record their age, breed, and their gender. Then to tag and so otherwise identify the individual animals so that an individual animal can be traced throughout all the different samples that will be collected. So any sample that is collected from an animal, if that identifying number can be placed on all of the samples, that would be helpful so that we can derive any sort of conclusions from the data from this experiment. It's important that all the animals be dewormed. It's been suggested to use Dromcil Plus or ivermectin, but anything that's typically used in camels in the UAE would be acceptable. And I would just like to say that if some sort of laboratory notebook can be started that's devoted solely for this experiment, and any sort of observation or changes or medications or anything that is done to the animals or that you observed during this experiment, if that could be recorded, that's always super helpful, especially as an experiment is completed and we're compiling the data 3 or 6 months later and trying to write up a manuscript. We can go back to that experimental lab notebook and see some observations that were made that may not seem significant to you at the time, but are important for deriving out some of the trends that we can pull out of the data. So it's important that the animals be on feed for 2 weeks with a 0 concentration of lolitrin and ergovalin in it, so that their rumen microbiota and their digestive system can kind of adapt to that type of forage, so that when we do begin the experiment, that that confounding variable of adapting to a different forage isn't part of the experiment, that we're solely looking at the toxicity here. Also, it's important to provide trace mineral salts and other any other sort of supplementation that you might need to provide a healthy diet for camels. And again, if that can be recorded in the notebook, exactly what the camels are being given every day, and even sources of water, do they just have free access to it, size of the pens, all that kind of information is very helpful to have when we do get to the point where we write up this experiment for a manuscript. So now I'm going to move on to the measurements that should be taken daily with all of the animals. Generally this is done in the morning or at a certain set time, so whatever time is convenient for the investigators and the people performing the study is fine. It's just best that if it can be done about the same time every day, so that we're measuring roughly 24 hours in between different measurements. First we'll begin with the feed. So it's important to weigh the amount of feed that's put in each feeding bin in the morning, and then when you come in the next day or at the next feeding period, because I believe you guys are feeding them twice a day, to measure the amount that's left over, if there's any left over. If there's none left over, just put a 0 in the column and that's fine. But if there is some feed left over, it's important to note that, because then we will go back and do a statistical analysis and see if the animals that were feeding a higher concentration of feed were resisting or not feeding as much of the feed, because we have seen that as a trend in some of the animals in the feeding experiments that we've done, and so we just need to analyze for that and make sure that that is not happening. So the equipment needed for this is simply a scale to measure the bulk feed amounts. And obviously that should be kept in the barn or the place where the feeding trial is being conducted, just for convenience sake. Then it's also important to measure the orts or the feed that is left over. And so this also tells us if there's different animals consuming different amounts of feed in the different experimental groups. So now I'll move on to the body morphometrics, and these are just measurements that are taken on each individual animal. We weren't sure if there was some sort of general body scoring system that was available or used on camels, but again, these are a little bit more general observations. So if you're looking at musculature and general overall condition of the animal, if those sort of things could be noted, that would be helpful. But as far as getting into specific measurements, if we could measure the distal forelimb temperature using a skin thermometer, it's usually some sort of infrared type of thermometer that's used. This will help us determine if there's any underlying effects effects coming from the ergot alkaloids that could be present in the feed. Then also measuring body temperature daily, and we in the United States generally use a rectal thermometer to do this in sheep or cattle, and so I'm assuming the same sort of procedure could be used in cattle or in camels. And then also, again, as far as more of an observational type of thing, looking at the condition of all four hooves, it would also be good to take a picture of the hooves, and I know Dr. Blythe in her video about looking at the staggers kind of indicated this, that it'd be good to film or photo or do both of all of the animals at the very beginning of the experiment, so we know what the hooves look like at the very beginning before they have been fed any toxic feed, so that we can monitor for the presence of gangrene or formation of that coronary band above the hoof. And it looks sort of, when it does form, like the animal has come across some sort of wire or something. It's sort of just a bloody type of line that occurs just above the hoof region. And so if you start to see this appearing, this is an indication that the animal is consuming too much of the ergot alkaloids, and definitely conversation should be started as far as possibly removing these animals from the feed and putting them on a zero concentration of the toxin for the remainder of the feeding trial. I've already talked about grabbing samples of the feed. But as far as analyzing for the toxins ergovaline and lolitrin B in the feed, you want to take a random sample of the feed. And so this means that you take a large gallon-sized Ziploc bag and take maybe 5 to 7 different random handfuls of the feed and put it into that bag. It's very important that it be randomly grabbed. We have chopped and mixed the feed thoroughly, and so we believe it to be a pretty homogeneous mixture, but we have found that there are different what we would call hot spots in the feed, where some of the straw will have higher concentration of the toxins than the others will. And so it's important to make sure that it's a truly random sampling of that feed. So as you're dumping the feed into the bins each morning, take your Ziploc bag and take 7 random samples and put it in the Ziploc bag. And then also the same procedure would carry over to doing the orts, in that any of the feed that is left over in between the feeding periods, if you could also, if there is any feed left over, if you could randomly grab different samples of that, and that will tell us if the animals are able to preferentially sort of screen out with their nose and other things the areas of the hay that have lower amounts of the toxin than others. And again, we will do a statistical analysis to basically show, hopefully, that the animals consumed the toxin in basically equal amounts from what was put into the feed, and weren't able to parse out feed that was more toxic than the other. And I actually just mentioned using a Ziploc bag. We have actually preferred that people put these into brown paper bags. We have found that when the feed goes into Ziploc bags, especially if it sits there for a longer period of time, that it, if there is any moisture whatsoever, it will start molding, and then we basically can't even do the analysis for the ergovaline in that feed. So if all of these feed samples could be thoroughly dried and then put into brown paper bags, that would be great. So next I'm going to move on to measurements that should be taken once every 2 days. And basically this was just doing the videotape as Dr. Blythe described in detail, so I think I'm just going to leave it at that, and if Dr. Craig wanted to add any additional information, he can at this time. So next I'll move on to the measurements that are to be taken weekly. Again, it's not doesn't really matter exactly which day you pick, but just pick a day and then keep consistent that that is the day each week that these measurements are taken on. We ask that each animal be weighed on a livestock scale, so again, once a week, move all of the animals through and record their weight. Record the resting heart rates. So obviously we want to do this when the animals are not excited, so if it's possible for people to walk into the pens and take the resting heart rate of the animals without getting them too excited, that would be best. Also, again, taking the resting respiratory rate, again with minimal agitation of the animals. And then as far as taking blood samples once a week, it's going to amount to needing 2 red top tubes and 1 purple top vacutainer tubes. One of the red top tubes will be used for doing a chem screen. I believe these tests are going to be conducted over at the UAE, and these are different CBC counts and other things like that. We also will need to do a prolactin, and this helps us determine if the animals are having effects due to the ergot alkaloids in the feed. And this is in a second red-topped vacutainer tube. So again, if you can, it's going to be 3 tubes total, 2 red-top vacutainer tubes and 1 purple-topped vacutainer tubes, taking blood from all 24 animals once a week. Lastly, we'll move on to the measurements that are to be taken bi-weekly, so once every 2 weeks. Just for convenience sake, if this can happen on the same day that you're taking the weekly measurements, that would help facilitate doing some of the statistical analyses in the study as well. And so bi-weekly, if you want to sample the feed and do different feed component analyses like dry matter, protein, neutral detergent fiber, acid detergent fiber, organic matter, acid detergent lignin, total digestible nutrients, and crude protein. That I believe is to be done at UAE University or the pathology lab there. However you guys want to collect and store that feed is up to you. Again, I mentioned the difference between Ziploc and paper bags. Paper bags probably is a better option, just so that the feed has no chance of molding and basically contaminating what's already in the feed. And then lastly is the urine and fecal samples. So if those could again be collected once every 2 weeks, and if you can collect 10 mils of urine and 10 grams of fecal material from each animal, that will enable us to do the agar alkaloid analyses from what the animals are actually excreting. So for the urine, if you simply can collect those into plastic centrifuge tubes and then freeze them immediately, that would be great. And then the feces, though, does need to be dried and dried to completion. We typically do this in a chemical hood, but it can also be done just on a countertop. It's just important that these materials be kept out of the light. So if there's a room where the windows have some blinds that can be drawn and that kind of thing, overhead lights aren't as big of a deal, but we do prefer that in general the samples be dried in the dark if at all possible. And so the way we determine if the feces is completely dry is once it appears to be just visually dry, we can weigh it from one day to the next, and then if we determine that there is no real weight change from one day to the next, that means all the water and liquid has evaporated out of the fecal material, and we can then determine that the feces is dry. The feces then can be placed into Ziploc bags and then frozen. However you guys want to ship this to us for the analyses is up to you, as far as if you want to collect a bunch of samples and then ship them to us in bulk, or if you want to collect them at the end of month 1 and then the end of month 2. Whatever is most convenient for you guys is fine with us. But then, yeah, once the feces is dried, it should be frozen, and the urine should be frozen. These materials should also be shipped frozen, if at all possible. So if you have dry ice and things like that that can keep the urine and the feces completely frozen in between transit from the UAE and the United States, that would be best. And so I think that's about it. So if you have any questions, I'm sure Dr. Craig can address any more specifics regarding the sample collection, but I wish you guys well, and I hope you have a great experiment. Thank you.